"Take it all off," Mountain Man commanded the obese girl, but what he did next made her his queen. "Take it all off," the stranger commanded. For a split second, Constance Connie Ashford thought he was one of them, one more brute coming to strip her of the last shreds of dignity she had left. The forest was silent except for her ragged breathing and the fading hoof-beats of the outlaws who had just robbed her. Only minutes before, she had been walking the lonely dirt road between Silver Creek and Fort Collins, clutching a small satchel and her mother's silver locket. 3 men on horseback had cornered her. They laughed at her sighs, at her trembling, at her begging. They took her money and ripped her dress to shreds, searching for more. Then came the gunfire. 2 shots, 1 scream. The rest scattered into the trees. Now standing before her was a tall man with a weathered face and eyes cold as mountain ice. His rifle still smoked. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't cruel. He was something worse calm, controlled, unreadable. I said, "Take it off," he repeated. "You're bleeding. The cloth is filthy. If we don't clean it now, you'll be infected before nightfall." The words struck her like thunder. He wasn't threatening. He was commanding, yes, but with the weight of concern. Connie froze, shame and confusion colliding. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Augustus Ironwood," he said. "People used to call me Marshal Ironwood." He crouched to pick up her torn shawl, then met her eyes. "You'll live, but only if you do what I say." And so began the story of a woman broken by cruelty and the man who would rebuild her not with pity, but with discipline, respect, and something far deeper. Where are you listening from tonight? Because on this mountain a queen is about to be born. Constance Ashford had never known what it meant to be seen. All her life, people had looked through her, never at her. In Denver, they called her the big girl who mends clothes. On the wagon road, she was the fat woman walking alone. Even the preacher who'd baptized her once said God gave her a heavy burden to teach humility. Now, on this desolate road, stripped of pride and nearly stripped of life, she stared up at the man who had just saved her from a fate worse than death. Augustus Ironwood. The name alone carried weight. Every sheriff, bounty hunter, and drifter in the territory had heard of the marshal who tamed the Black Range and vanished into the mountains after his wife and son were killed in a raid. Some said he lost his mind. Others whispered he'd become a ghost haunting the wilderness. But the man before her was flesh and blood, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver streaks in his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Can you stand?" he asked. Connie tried, but her legs buckled. Gus caught her before she fell, his hands firm yet gentle. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." Tears burned her eyes. Safe. The word felt foreign. He lifted her effortlessly and carried her to his horse. "You'll freeze if we stay here," he said. "There's a stream not far ahead. We'll clean those wounds." "I can't go with you," she stammered. "I don't even know you." He gave a faint smirk. "If I meant you harm, you'd already know it." The logic was brutal, but true. She said nothing more. When they reached the stream, Gus built a fire with practiced speed. The flames flickered against the granite cliffs, casting their shadows like ghosts. Connie sat wrapped in his coat, trembling from more than the cold. "Hold out your hands," Gus said. She obeyed without thinking. His touch was rough but sure, the touch of a man used to saving lives. He cleaned her cuts, his silence heavy, but not unkind. Finally, he spoke. Why were you out here alone?" "I was on my way to the Henderson ranch," Connie said softly. "They said they needed help for the winter." Gus frowned. "Henderson sold that land a week ago. There's no work waiting for you there." She blinked, the words hitting her harder than the bandit's blows. "Then, what do I do now?" He poured whiskey on a cloth and pressed it against a deeper cut on her leg. She hissed in pain, but he didn't pull away. "First, you heal," he said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." His tone left no room for argument. It wasn't kindness alone, it was command, and oddly, it steadied her. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't mocking her, pitying her, or apologizing for her. He was leading her. As night fell, Gus handed her a cup of hot coffee and stared into the fire. "The world's cruel to women who stand alone," he said quietly. "Up on that mountain, I can keep you safe if you'll trust me enough to come." Connie looked at him through the dancing light. Trust. The word tasted dangerous, like something she might never recover from. But looking into those steady eyes, she realized something deep inside her had already decided. "I'll come," she whispered, and with that single choice, her journey toward becoming something more than a victim, more than a survivor, had begun. The morning broke cold and pale over the Colorado hills, frost clinging to the branches like tiny shards of glass. Connie woke wrapped in Gus's heavy wool coat, the scent of pine and gun oil lingering on it. Her muscles ached, her wounds throbbed, but she was alive. Gus was already saddling the horse, moving with the quiet precision of a soldier. The campfire was down to embers, and steam rose from the pot where he was boiling water. He didn't speak until she stirred. "Eat," he said, handing her a tin cup of coffee and a piece of hard bread softened in broth. "You'll need your strength." Connie took it with trembling hands. The warmth filled her, chasing away the edge of fear. "Where are we going?" she asked after a long silence. "Copper Mountain," he replied. "My cabin's halfway up the ridge, safer than any town." The ride began just as the sun crested the horizon. They moved through canyons lined with golden aspens, the air sharp with the coming of winter. The road twisted along a narrow pass where the world below looked endless. Gus rode ahead, scanning every shadow. Connie followed on his second horse, a mare he called Rosemary, her body swaying awkwardly with the rhythm of the trail. Every so often, Gus would glance back to check on her. When she lagged behind, he slowed. When her hand slipped on the reins, he corrected her grip without a word. "Are you always this bossy?" she muttered once, breathless from the climb. "Kept a lot of men alive that way," he said simply. By noon, snow began to fall thin and soft at first, then heavier as they climbed higher. Connie's fingers were numb, but Gus seemed unaffected. His coat was dusted white, his movements steady as clockwork. They stopped by a frozen stream where he built another fire. Connie's cheeks burned from the wind, and her hair stuck damply to her forehead. "You're freezing," he said, kneeling beside her. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick fur cloak. "Put this on." "It's yours," she protested. "Now it's yours," he replied. "You don't argue with orders when they save your life." There was that word again, orders. She should have hated it, yet something in his tone made her feel strangely safe. As the fire crackled, she found herself studying him. His hands were scarred, his jaw square, his eyes scanning the tree line even while he ate. But when he looked at her, those eyes softened. "Why do you live up here alone?" she finally asked. Gus didn't answer right away. He tossed another branch into the fire, the flames lighting the silver in his beard. "The world below's too loud," he said at last. "Up here I can hear myself think and forget what I've lost." Connie understood more than she said. She, too, had spent years trying to disappear from the noise of judgment, the whispers, the pity. Maybe isolation wasn't just punishment, it was survival. When they resumed their journey, the snow was falling thick now, the horses' hooves crunching over ice. Connie's strength was fading fast, and by dusk she was swaying in the saddle. Gus noticed immediately. He dismounted, lifted her down without a word, and wrapped his arm around her waist. "Another half-mile," he murmured. "You can do that." "I'm heavy," she whispered weakly. "You'll tire." He looked down at her, expression unchanging. "I've carried men twice your size through gunfire," he said. "You're fine." When they finally reached the ridge, the cabin appeared through the storm, a large wooden structure half buried in snow, smoke rising from its chimney. Inside, warmth wrapped around her like a living thing. The smell of cedar, the glow of the fire, the steady rhythm of the wind outside, it all felt impossibly safe. "This is home," Gus said quietly, helping her to a chair by the fire, "at least for now." Connie stared into the flames, her body trembling from exhaustion and emotion alike. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt rescued. And as Gus hung his rifle on the wall, she realized something else. He hadn't just saved her life. He was changing it. That first night on Copper Mountain, Connie barely slept. Every creak of the timbers, every gust of wind against the cabin walls kept her alert, until she realized Gus was still awake, sitting by the fire, sharpening his knife with the same calm rhythm of a man who trusted only himself. "Do you ever rest?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He looked up from his work. "When I know the person under my roof can rest safely." Something about the quiet certainty in his tone stilled the shaking in her chest. The next morning, Gus had already made breakfast. Thick oatmeal, brewed coffee, and a slice of dried venison. "Eat all of it," he said as she sat up. "Your body's in shock. You'll need food to fight infection." Connie obeyed, surprised by how naturally she followed his direction. He didn't bark orders like a tyrant. He issued them the way a storm commands a mountain, inevitable, steady, protective. As days turned into weeks, their routine took shape. Gus rose before dawn to check traps and firewood, while Connie swept the cabin, washed clothes, and tended the small herb garden that grew near the window. The cabin was sturdy, built from thick pine logs, with a stone hearth at its center. Shelves of books and maps lined one wall, alongside medals and an old cavalry saber that told silent stories of a lifelong past. When she asked about them, Gus shrugged. "Trophies from a world that made me tired." "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't miss who I had to be to survive it." Connie nodded, understanding more than she said. Every scar he carried, she carried in her own way, hers invisible, carved by words instead of bullets. In the evenings, Gus would read aloud by the fire old military journals, poetry, even pages from medical books. His voice, low and steady, filled the cabin with a kind of peace Connie hadn't known since childhood. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, glance up, and catch her watching him. "What?" he'd ask, half a smile playing under his beard. "Nothing," she'd say quickly, though her heart always betrayed her with its sudden racing. But it wasn't just peace she found there. Under Gus's guidance, she grew stronger physically and in spirit. He taught her to load and fire his revolver, to aim for the trunk of a pine tree until she could hit it from 30 feet away. "Good," he'd say simply after each shot. "Again." She learned to chop wood cleanly, to ride a horse without fear, to read maps and follow trails. Each lesson replaced the shame she carried her whole life with something far more powerful: pride. "You're not helpless, Connie," he told her one afternoon after she struck a target dead center. "You never were. You were just never given a reason to believe it." She turned to him, eyes bright. "And you think I'm worth teaching?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "I don't waste time on what isn't worth it." Something unspoken passed between them, then a spark neither dared name. But the world beyond the cabin hadn't forgotten her. Word of the fat girl saved by the old marshal had spread through the nearby towns, twisting into rumor and ridicule. One morning, when Gus returned from the trading post, his jaw was tight. "They've been talking," he said, setting down the supplies. "Said you're living up here out of wedlock, that I bought you for company." Connie froze, shame flooding her again. I never meant to cause you trouble." Gus's voice softened. "You didn't. People always find sin where they can't see understanding." He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Let them talk. We know the truth." And just like that, the storm outside lost its power. That night, Connie stood at the cabin door, watching the snow fall across the valley. The fire behind her cast a warm glow that touched every corner of the room. She turned to see Gus at his desk, head bent over a map, silver hair glinting in the light. For the first time, she saw not the man who had saved her, but the man who had rebuilt her. He looked up then, sensing her gaze. "Something on your mind?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I finally feel like I belong somewhere." He held her eyes for a long moment, the ghost of a smile crossing his lips. "Good," he said quietly. "Then my work here isn't finished yet." Outside, the mountain wind howled. Inside, a new warmth bloomed, quiet, patient, unstoppable. Spring came late that year, dripping slowly down the mountain in rivulets of melting snow. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. Connie had been at the cabin for nearly 6 months now, and Copper Mountain no longer felt like exile. It felt like home. She could split logs cleanly with a single swing, ride alone into the valley, and shoot straighter than most men Gus had served with. The woman who had once trembled in fear on the roadside had vanished. In her place stood someone calm, capable, and sure of herself. But peace, as Gus often said, is the silence before trouble remembers where to find you. It began with a letter. One morning, Gus came back from town with his usual supplies and a folded envelope marked with the seal of the U.S. Marshal's office. He read it once, his expression hardening, then tucked it into his pocket. Connie, kneading bread dough at the table, caught the flicker of tension in his eyes. "Bad news?" she asked carefully. He hesitated. Old ghosts. Later that night, when he thought she was asleep, Connie saw him take the letter from his coat and read it again by lamplight. His hands shook ever so slightly. She waited until morning. "You were a marshal once," she said quietly, "and they want you back, don't they?" He didn't deny it. "They're short on men. There's a gang moving through these territories, same bastards who raided the army post years ago. They've hit miners, mail wagons, even families, and they're coming this way." Connie felt a chill colder than the mountain wind. "You think they'll come here?" "I know they will," he said. "They never finish a trail without blood at the end of it." For the first time since she'd met him, she saw fear behind his steady gaze, not for himself, but for her. "You should go down to the valley," he said firmly. "Stay with the preacher's wife in Silver Creek until I send for you." "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "Connie," he warned, "this isn't pride, it's survival." "And what about you?" she fired back. "You think I'll just hide while you stand alone again? You taught me to fight, Gus. Don't you dare take that away from me now." He stared at her for a long moment, torn between instinct and admiration. Then, finally, he nodded once. "All right, but you follow my orders. You hear me?" "Yes, Marshal," she said, and he almost smiled. They spent the next 2 days preparing, shoring up the fences, loading rifles, storing water and ammunition. Connie worked beside him without complaint, her hands raw, her body aching. When the work was done, Gus stood on the porch, scanning the valley below through his spyglass. "They're close," he murmured. Connie stepped beside him. "How many?" "Too many." As twilight fell, the first riders appeared, a dozen dark figures moving like shadows through the snow-melt fog. The leader carried a scar across his cheek and a hatred in his eyes that no lawman could ever erase. When he saw Gus's cabin, he grinned. "That's him," the man spat. "Ironwood, let's finish what we started." Inside the cabin, Connie's heart pounded, but her hands were steady as she loaded the revolver Gus had given her months before. "You don't have to do this," he said one last time. "Yes," she whispered, "I do." Outside, the sound of hooves thundered closer. Gus positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. Connie took her place at the door, the crackling fire lighting her face. "Stay low," he said. "Wait for my signal." The first shot shattered the night. Connie didn't flinch. The woman who once wept in fear was gone. In her place stood a fighter, a woman who'd been forged by fire, rebuilt by discipline, and strengthened by love. And as the battle began to rage around their mountain home, she finally understood what Gus meant when he'd once told her, "You don't find freedom by running, you find it by standing your ground." The first bullet shattered the lamp by the window, plunging half the cabin into shadow. Gus ducked behind the table, firing 2 clean shots into the dark. One outlaw fell. The others dismounted and took cover behind boulders. "Stay down!" Gus barked. Connie crouched low, heart pounding so loud she could hear it over the thunder of gunfire. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the air, sharp and acrid. But her hands didn't tremble. She moved exactly as Gus had taught her, slow, steady, deliberate. Through a crack in the shutter, she saw a flash of movement. A man was circling the back of the cabin. Without thinking, she grabbed the revolver, slid to the rear door, and waited. When it creaked open, she fired once. The intruder dropped before he could raise his weapon. The echo of her shot rolled through the trees like a drumbeat. Gus turned, startled, then met her eyes. "Good girl," he said, his voice rough with pride. But the fight wasn't over. More riders came charging up the slope, shouting curses that cut through the cold night air. The leader, the scarred man Gus had recognized, rode straight toward the porch, firing wildly. Gus stepped outside into the snow, rifle raised, every inch of him the marshal he once was. "Vargas!" he shouted. "You and I end this here." The outlaw sneered. "You took everything from me, Ironwood. Tonight I take it back." Their shots rang out almost simultaneously. Vargas's bullet grazed Gus's shoulder. Gus's struck true, sending the outlaw tumbling from his horse. The others hesitated just long enough for Connie to step out beside Gus, her revolver aimed dead steady. Her face was pale, but her voice didn't shake. "Go," she said. "You've got one chance." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one by one, the outlaws turned their horses and vanished down the trail, swallowed by the darkness. When the last hoofbeat faded, silence fell heavy as the snow. Gus lowered his rifle, breathing hard. Blood soaked his sleeve, but his eyes were still sharp. Connie rushed to his side. "You're hurt." He managed a wry smile. "Just a scratch. You shoot better than half the deputies I ever had." She pressed a trembling hand to his arm, tears spilling freely now that the danger was gone. "You could have been killed." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "So could you, but you didn't run." Her voice broke. "Because you taught me how not to." He looked at her for a long time, then leaned his forehead against hers. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and clean, covering the blood and the broken ground as if the mountain itself wished to erase the violence. "Connie," he whispered, voice low and steady, "no matter what comes next, you've already earned your crown." By dawn, the smoke had cleared. The cabin stood strong against the bruised sky, its roof dusted white with new snow. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney-proof of life, of defiance. Inside, the air was warm again, rich with the smell of coffee and firewood. Gus sat in his chair, his arm bandaged where Connie had cleaned and stitched the wound. He watched her move quietly about the room, gathering spent shells from the floor, straightening the table they'd overturned in the fight. Her hair was messy, her dress torn at the sleeve, but to him she looked radiant. "You should rest," he said softly. She shook her head. "Queens don't rest when their kingdom still smells of smoke." He smiled faintly. "Is that what this is? My old cabin, your kingdom?" She looked around, her gaze landing on the fire, the rifles on the wall, the light breaking through the frosted windows. "Ours," she said. "You built the walls, but I helped defend them. That makes it ours." For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of a hawk, and somewhere far below, the thawing river roared to life again. Spring was coming slowly, stubbornly, just like them. Gus finally stood, walked to her side, and took her hand. "You're not the same woman I found on that road." "No," she whispered, eyes glistening. "You didn't just save me, Gus. You trained me to save myself." He brushed his thumb across her knuckles. "You were never meant to serve anyone, Connie. You were meant to rule beside someone strong enough to see it." The firelight danced in her eyes as she smiled. "Then maybe I already am." Outside, the sun crested over Copper Mountain, and for the first time, the world below felt small, because up here, a queen had claimed her throne. Sometimes the strongest crowns aren't made of gold, they're forged in fire, loss, and courage. Connie never asked to be saved. She asked to be seen, and in the quiet strength of one mountain man, she found the mirror that showed her who she truly was. Gus didn't make her a queen. He reminded her that she'd always been one she just needed to stand tall enough to wear it. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? If you still believe love can rebuild what the world tried to break, stay a little longer. The next story is already waiting for you.